In this video, I hope to clarify a few points about sonata form. I believe this may be helpful to those who want to understand what's going on in the writing of the great symphonic composers from Haydn through Mahler, and sometimes find themselves lost in a great wash of musical ideas. Perhaps the best way to understand the form is to trace its origins, beginning with the two-part dance movements that were composed by musicians in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. I want to start with a simple enough observation. Of all the music known to me, from all around the world and from over a vast period of time, it seems to be Western music of the late 17th century to the present that exhibits the characteristic called modulation, a studied movement between key centers for some kind of aesthetic effect. Modulation can exercise a long-range organizing influence on music, which is easy enough to understand if you simply consider the following. Once a composer puts the first note on paper, that composer becomes an artist with two options to choose from. Either he can start here and go there, or start here, go there, and come back here. It's the latter course that we usually hear exemplified in classical music of the era under examination, and it can be accomplished in a number of ways. Obviously, one can return after a time to a melody that was presented at the beginning of the composition, after a digression into alien territory. More to the point under consideration, one can return to an initially established key center after a sojourn in some other key. The earliest instances of this feature seem to be found in dance music of the late 17th century. Those dances were generally in two parts, which could be called strains, and the parts were repeated. The usual pattern is for a dance movement in a major key to modulate to its dominant key, that is, the next brighter key on the circle of fifths, by the end of the first strain. So a dance that began in D major, for instance, would find its way to A major by the end of that opening strain. By repeating that strain, we hear the same journey made twice. The second strain then picks up where the first strain leaves off, probably visits some other keys, and eventually contrives to return the music to its primary key. By repeating the second strain, one also hears this tonal journey a second time. Dance music in minor keys follows a similar pattern, except that the modulation is usually from the primary key to its mediant key, also known as the relative major. It was a common practice to present such dance movements in pairs. So you might have a pair of minuets, for instance, both of them consisting of two repeated strains that followed the tonal pattern I sketched just now. In such cases, you would hear the first minuet with its internal repeats, then the second minuet with its internal repeats, and then the composer would call for a reprise of the first minuet by writing da capo al fine, go back to the beginning and play to the conclusion, after the second minuet. Furthermore, it was often the case that the second minuet of the pair would call for reduced instrumentation for purposes of contrast. It is this feature of so much Baroque dance music that gave rise to the minuet and trio symphonic movements of Haydn and others, which follow the same basic plan, although usually in a much more adventuresome and sophisticated way. Let's start this exploration of sonata form by hearing a couple of representative examples of what I've been talking about. The first is by Georg Friedrich Handel, a German composer born in 1685, who lived most of his life in England. This is a minuet movement from an F major concerto grosso published in 1734. The performance is by the Academy of Ancient Music. I'll put links to these performances in the info bar below in hopes that you might be moved to purchase some of them if you like what you hear. Note that in the example I just gave you, the first minuet was brought back in its entirety, internal repeats and all. This raises the question of whether we ought not to do the same thing in Haydn's symphonic minuet movements. I'm persuaded that we should, although many conductors elect not to observe them the second time through. I'll address this issue in more detail when I get to my guided tour of Haydn's 97th Symphony, which I believe settles the question. Now, let's hear some minor key dance music for an illustration of how the music moves from the main key to its relative major. This time, the music is by Johann Sebastian Bach, born the same year as Handel. This is a pair of bourrées from Bach's Second Orchestral Suite, written about a decade earlier than that dance music by Handel. In this case, the music is in B minor, and we expect to hear modulations to the relative major key, D major. Let's reflect briefly on a feature of that Bach excerpt that I pointed out in passing in my written commentary. The proportions of the second bourrée were halved from those of the first, yet it was still true of both of those bourrées, and of the first minuet in the pair by Handel, that the second strain was twice as long as the first. Now think about the proportions we usually see in movements in sonata form. First, there's a repeated exposition consisting of two themes in contrasting keys, usually the same key relationships as those we've seen in these dance movements. The second big part of a sonata form movement begins with the development section that follows that exposition. It can easily be as long as the exposition, and there's still the recapitulation to go. Moreover, in the earliest symphonies, including many by Haydn, the entire second part, consisting of development and recapitulation, was also repeated, so the proportions would have remained roughly the same as those of these Baroque dance movement forebears, even though the scale has been greatly expanded. Now let's go to an early symphony and hear its first movement, which is in rudimentary sonata form. I say rudimentary only because we cannot avoid comparing this music to the later models of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, which go far beyond these narrow confines. Nevertheless, this is very charming and beautifully crafted music by Giovanni Battista Sammartini, who wrote this G major symphony sometime around 1740. We will hear only its first movement, which is in sonata form. My reason for talking about melodies rather than themes in my discussion of the Sammartini work is that there's often little clear-cut distinction in that composer's music between material that is thematic and material that is transitional. But in the next example, the first movement of Amadeus Mozart's much-loved Little Serenade, or Eine kleine Nachtmusik, also in G major, the distinctions are quite clear. This is light music with no symphonic pretensions, composed in 1787, and sets forth a particularly clear example of sonata form. Repeats are indicated for both large sections of the work, although Nadja Salerno-Sonnenberg, who leads this live performance by the New Century Chamber Orchestra, elected not to observe the second one. She also elected not to play in tune, but that's a different matter. I hope that little survey proved helpful. If you can keep in mind those basic organizational ideas that informed so much early 18th century dance music, especially the modulation tendencies and general proportions, and remember that sonata form movements will probably reflect both of those things, you'll have a good foundation for understanding much else that happens in symphonic music. Needless to say, the more extended the composition, the more time there will be between formal points of articulation, and the greater opportunity for the composer to do adventuresome things. I sometimes find it helpful to keep the panorama of limbed vertebrate evolution in mind as an analogy. Ever since the first tetrapod vertebrates crawled out of late Devonian swamps, we limbed vertebrates ranging from amphibians to reptiles, dinosaurs, birds, and mammals exhibit variations on the same limb pattern. Starting from a shoulder or hip, we see a hinged limb that goes from one bone to two at the elbow or knee, then a flexible wrist or ankle, then quite a few bones, then hinged digits. One basic plan for millions of land-going vertebrate species. The development of sonata form from its earliest dance music antecedents is something like that.